On Saturday, Hamas militants attacked Israeli citizens in what is being called the deadliest single day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. The death toll in Israel has exceeded 1,100 souls, and the Palestinian death toll in Gaza is similar. And as all of this has happened, social media has erupted, with people updating their bios with "I stand with Israel" or "Free Palestine," two completely opposed camps. It's confusing, it's noisy, and it begs the question, how did we even get here? Why are these two sides fighting, and where does it all go next? And the answer to this question is as terrifying as it is heartbreaking. So in order to understand what's happening today, we need to go back in time a little over 100 years to Western Europe before World War I, where an idea was being thrown around amongst intellectuals and European elites that would see the European Jewish population relocated to Palestinian land that in biblical times was the nation of Israel. And this concept of reestablishing Israel came to be known as Zionism. Now, Zionism caught on amongst the European political elites, and soon advocates, financial backers, politicians got behind the idea and began to promote it, encouraging Jews to move to Palestine to establish a Jewish community. And this happened quietly at first. Small Jewish settlements were built up, and this was done peacefully alongside the Muslim Arab community that was already there. And all of this happened under the control of the Ottoman Empire, who controlled the region and maintained the peace. But all of that ended in 1914 when World War I broke out. And at that time, British elites saw an opportunity to further the movement of Zionism, because 3 years after the war began in 1917, the British government publicly announced their support for the formation of an Israeli nation on Palestinian land. And this declaration was made without consulting the Muslim Arabs that already called that land home. Now, this statement came to be known as the Balfour Declaration. And when it was drafted in 1917, Palestine was still under the control of the Ottoman Empire. The war hadn't even ended yet. Great Britain didn't even have claim to that land, but the British made plans for the land anyway, without consulting anyone, except for Lord Walter Rothschild, to whom the declaration was addressed. And this is where the entire current conflict that we're seeing unfold began. Because when World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the lands and territories belonging to the defeated Central Powers were split up, broken apart, and redistributed amongst the victors under something called the Mandate System. And the mandate for Palestine was given to the British, who had already decided what their mandate would be. And almost immediately, the British government and military helped Jews move and immigrate to Palestine. They helped them establish businesses and communities, and they also helped them form and train and arm a well-armed militia. But to the Palestinians that called this land home to begin with, the British were occupiers who were building a new Jewish nation on stolen land. So the Palestinians, who had no say in this at any point, revolted. And between 1936 and 1939, thousands of people lost their lives in horrific attacks and acts of violence in the region. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and this British plan for a new Jewish nation clearly wasn't working. But despite all of the tension in Palestine, Jews continued to enter the region because persecution in Europe towards Jews had reached a fever pitch and turned into a full-fledged Holocaust where over 6 million Jews were murdered. But as more Jewish immigrants arrived in Palestine, the situation continued to become more tense. And Great Britain, who set this whole thing up in the first place, now had no intention of resolving any of the problems that were now bubbling up, because Britain was no longer the world's superpower. They were exhausted from fighting 2 world wars, and they no longer had the desire to stand with the Jewish settlements that they helped establish. And in 1948, the British government essentially abandoned their project in Palestine as they withdrew their presence from the region and dumped the responsibility of all of this on the newly formed United Nations, who immediately drew lines and officially recognized the nation of Israel on May 14, 1948. Again, all of this happened without consulting native Palestinians. And this is the oversimplified story of what got us to where we are today. Because between 1917 and 1947, Jews had been moving into Palestine on Arab land that they had no claim to. But the Jews weren't in the wrong either, because they were moving there based on a promise made by the British government, a promise that pitched to the Jewish Jewish people, that Israel would be established on this land as a safe haven for all of the Jews of Europe. But after World War II ended, it was a promise that the British just couldn't keep. They weren't interested in it. They didn't follow through because it was already a disaster. The situation is essentially if a British guy told you that he had a great car that he wanted to sell you. Then that British dude goes and steals your neighbor's car, sells it to you without you understanding what just happened, and then that dude bounces. So is it your car? You paid for it, but it's also your neighbor's car. So what happens here? With half of the world wanting to free Palestine and the other half standing with Israel, both of whom are victims in this story, we are all just praying that this doesn't spill into World War III. And it could, because this entire story carries an important lesson with it, and it's this. The only thing that wars produce consistently is more wars. And usually those wars are fought by people who weren't even born when the seeds for those conflicts were sown. And that's the case with what's happening today. Now, with the actions that we're seeing on Saturday, Hamas is without a doubt a terrorist organization. In this last week, they have murdered, raped, tortured, and kidnapped civilians. They've beheaded babies and set the homes of families on fire with them still alive inside. And they have live streamed these atrocities, and it needs to be stopped. But the West needs to be careful about how they stop it, because the West has a knack for making things much worse when they try to make them better, just like the British did at the conclusion of World War I. And making things worse really is the legacy of Western governments, who arrogantly seem to think that they will do a good job of shaping the global landscape on foreign soil. And the question that we're all left with now is, how does this conflict between Israel and Palestine resolve without dragging the entire globe back into another world war? Because collectively, we can't afford that. Albert Einstein himself once said, "I know not what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." We are in the darkest of times, people, with the weakest of leaders, and this whole thing, it's not good.